Hello everyone, welcome back to Sims and Notches. If this is your very first time, you are welcome. And if you are a returning subscriber, thank you so much for coming back. Today we have something very special. We are going to continue from our corset block, but this time we are going to be showing you how we join all the pieces together, that is sewing them together. So sit back, relax, and enjoy yourself. If you know you haven't yet subscribed to our channel, please do so. And please click on the notification button as well. And if you are not following us on all our social media platforms, what are you waiting for? So please do so by clicking on the link down the description box. Without taking much of your time, let's get started. So these are the materials that we are going to be using today. I have got my fabric, I've got my lining, I've got my interfacing, bra foam, fabric scissors, I've got our previously drafted corset pattern, I have got plastic boning, I've got sewing pins, bias pieces, I have got a measuring tape, I've got my sewing thread and underwires. If you're interested in some of the materials here, the links are down below the description box, so feel free to check them out. So to start off, I am going to press my fabric and my lining, then go ahead to fuse my fabric because my fabric is a bit light, so I just want to fuse it to give it a little bit of weight. So this is how it looks when it's fused together. So next I am going to lay my pattern pieces on my fabric. Remember, the center front is placed on fold, don't forget that, and make sure you follow all the grain lines before you start cutting out your pattern pieces. So we are going to do something a little bit different. For our cut bra, we have the normal pattern with all our seam allowance, and we have another pattern with some seam allowance, and as you can see, they're a bit different. We have all the seam allowance on this pattern. We have it underneath the top panel, and we have it at the side panel and the center panel. But for this one, we have all the seam allowance just at the side. So we don't have anything at the middle. So we don't have any seam allowance on top as well. We don't have the seam allowance underneath. So as you can see, it's just at the side we have the seam allowance. And this pattern is for the bra foam. And I will be showing you how we are going to use this pattern in a minute. So the first thing we're going to sew is our Brackhop. We are going to start with the main fabric. We're going to join both pairs together, making sure we follow all the notches. So at this point, you want to be very careful. Make sure you are joining all the right pieces together. So the center piece to the side piece, and the other is the center piece to the side piece as well. Once that is pinned together, we are going to join them with our sewing machine. Once you've joined the lower part of the cups together, you can go ahead to press it out with your iron. So once we are done pressing the lower part of our Brackhop, what we need to do next is to pin along the top panel of our Brackhop. Once we are done securing it, following all the notches, we'll go to our sewing machine to join all the patterns together. So once you're done securing all your patterns with your sewing pins, you can go ahead to join all the patterns with your sewing machine. And remember, for this, I am using 1 centimeter for my seam allowance. So next we are going to create our cups from our bra foam. Remember, I said there is no seam allowance at the top and there is no seam allowance at the bottom as well. So I am going to mirror this pattern. I have one, so I'm going to mirror them to make it a pair. Then I will get my marker to trace them all out. Make sure you trace all the notches. Remember, you don't have to do this step. Most people prefer to buy their own bra cups from the shops. You can do that if you can, but if you are like me that love to create things from scratch, you can go ahead and create yours. So once that is done, you cut them all out. And after that, we are going to join them together using our zigzag machine. Now you'll need a zigzag machine for this next step. So now I'm going to switch to a zigzag stitch, and that is in number 5. I'm just putting that on number 5. So once I'm done setting all the numbers and the type of stitch I want, I'm going to join my patterns together. Remember, we need to get the side pattern piece and the center pattern piece, and we're going to join them together, leaving no space, making sure we tightly press the foam together, giving no room or no space in between. And as we go along, or as we stitch along, we need to follow the notches, making sure all the notches are fitted in properly. So next we are going to go ahead to join the top panel, and like we did before, make sure you follow all the notches and gently sew your way through the top panel. So now the cups are ready. I am going to press this open to get rid of any crease. I am going to press this open using my Tailor hammer, and this just makes your life easier when you are pressing cups or sleeves. It's so much better using your Tailor hammer. In case you want any for purchase, I am going to leave the link down below. So now we have the bra cups in the main fabric, and we have the phone cups. The next part will be for us to join all the pattern pieces for the corset. So I'm going to gently take off the pins that I use in securing the patterns, and I'm going to get all the pattern pieces to match each other, following all my notches. So once my main fabric is secured with my sewing pins, I am going to join them using my sewing machine. But before then, I am going to cut out my patterns from my lining fabric, and I'm going to do exactly what I did for the main fabric to the lining fabric, and I'm going to join them using my sewing machine. So like we did for the main fabric, we are going to go ahead using our sewing pins to secure the lining fabric as well. So once we've secured our lining like so, we are going to move over to the breast cup area. And after that, we are going to secure the breast cup lining. And once that is pinned and secured, we're going to take it to our sewing machine to join all the pattern pieces together. We're first of all going to start with the lining. We're going to join all the pieces together. Then we'll move ahead to the main fabric and join all the pieces together. And remember, we are using 1 centimeter for our seam allowance. And once we've sewn our lining, we are going to press all the seams open. So gently, we are going to use our finger to trace the seam line open and use our pressing iron to press the seam line. Make sure you are really gentle at this point. So as you can see, we've pressed all the seam open. We are going to repeat the same step for the main fabric. Remember, while you are pressing, make sure to press the wrong side and the right side of your fabric. So once we have our main fabric and our lining pressed and all stitched up, so now we are going to focus on the Brackhop area. We are going to first of all take the main fabric of the Brackhop and we are going to press the seam upwards and press the center seam facing the center panel. So now I have my foam cup and this is the right side. I'm going to flip it to the wrong side and I'm going to get my lining piece and gently pin along all the edges. I'm going to attach my lining piece with my sewing pins. I'm going to secure it with my sewing pins. And I'm going to repeat that as well for the second cup. And make sure you follow all the notches. Once we are done using our sewing pins to secure the edges of the foam cup, we are going to use a stitch length of 2 millimeters or 3, and we're going to stitch around the edges. And we are going to repeat that for the second cup as well. So once we're done, we are going to trim around the edges. We just want to make it neat. Next, we need to locate the center point on our main fabric and as well as the foam cup. And once we've marked in our notches, we need to get our main fabric. And we want our right side, which is what we are seeing now, to face our lining. So we're just going to flip it like that. And this will be facing the lining that we have inside. We are going to stitch around the edges using 0.75 centimeters. And for this part, we are not going to stitch around the Brackhop. We are just stitching the top edge of the Brackhop. So once we're done stitching the top edge, we are going to trim around this area using our scissors. So all we need to do is to open the seam up and trim just the foam, not the main fabric. And we can trim it as low as possible, but be very careful. So now we've trimmed the top part of the foam. We are going to gently top stitch this part. That is the main fabric. We're going to top stitch it onto the foam and the lining, like so. You can use your pin to secure that. So we're just going to use our pin to secure it. So this part, we are going to top stitch it onto the foam, like so. So now this is done and this is how it should look. Next, you are going to flip the main fabric onto the foam and make sure the main fabric is covering all the edges of the foam. And you are going to also press this, make sure all the crease are gone, and as well as the lining. So you're going to repeat that for the second cup as well. Again, once the cups are secured, we need to stitch that using a 2 or 3 millimeter stitch length. So now this is ready. Again, just trim around the area and make sure you steam or press. For the corset, we are going to apply a top stitch on the seam, and we are going to apply that on every seam facing inside, that is inwards, the center front. And this is applied to only the main fabric, not the lining, just the main fabric. As you can see, I am pointing to where you need to top stitch. So once you've identified where needs to be top stitch, you can go ahead using your sewing machine to apply the top stitch. Make sure your top stitch is not too loose or too tight. You want to have enough room for your boning to be able to penetrate. And once you're done, make sure you give it a press, and we will move over to the next step. So once we are done top stitching our main fabric, we are going to join our lining to our main fabric. But this time we are going to join just the sides and the center, not around the bust area. Using 1 centimeter for my seam allowance, I'm going to stitch that with my sewing machine But before then, I am going to use my sewing pins to secure that in place. So what I did was to sew my seam allowance, then did a top stitch, but this time I stitched on the lining, not the main fabric, using 0.5 centimeter for my seam. So make sure you go ahead to press this part, make sure it's nice and smooth. So next I am going to attach the Brackhop to the corset. So at this point you need to gently align both pattern pieces together. Make sure none is raising above the other, so you have to be extremely careful at this point. So once that is done, it should look like this. All we need to do is to stitch around the edges to attach the Brackhop to the corset. Next, we need to flip the corset and we are going to work inside, especially the Brackhop area. We're going to get our bias piece to cover the rough edges, but before we do that, we need to make sure we secure all the edges and make sure everything is properly aligned. Then we are going to get our bias piece and cover the very first stitch line. We're going to sew on that stitch line. We're going to do like a top stitch on that stitch line, a very thin stitch line. We're going to place that on top. In order for us to get that correctly, we are going to take the foam part and place our bias piece on top of that. Then we are going to stitch along. So we're going to stitch on this line. Another thing, you have to be careful when you are stitching, because you don't want to stitch on the lining. You just want to stitch on the foam part, not on the lining. So now I am going to use my sewing machine to stitch on that line. So here it is. As you can see, the bias piece is already stitched on that line. So what we need to do next is to trim off the foam part. So we are going to cut through as gently as possible. You want to be careful not to cut off the bias piece. So now we are done with that. We are going to cover the foam area using our bias piece, and we are going to top stitch. So what we are doing in essence is to cover up the foam area, that is the rough area, with our bias. So we're going to cover that like so, and we are going to top stitch. So what I'm going to do is to get my needle and thread to first of all secure around the bust area. Use a very loose stitch, and this will help keep all the edges in place. So once both cups are done, we are going to stitch around where we loosely stitched with our needle and thread. So once we've created a channel for our underwire, we are going to get our underwire and penetrate that into the new channel that we've just created. Make sure everything is clean and tidy, and you can go ahead to press this if you want. And once that is done, you can start to penetrate the underwire through the channel. So once that is done, you can get your unpicker to unpick the loose stitch that we previously did. So now I'm gently going to finish the bias pieces. So what I'm doing, I'm folding the S's. I'm still going to cut out from this. So I'm just going to cut out a little bit and fold the S's in, and either top stitch or use my needle and thread to neatly finish that part. So now my corset is almost ready. All I need to do is to give this a press. But before I do that, I am going to make sure I penetrate all the bonings into the channel provided. So here I am using a 12mm boning, and I'm going to fold it into 2, and that will make it 6mm. So I'm just using my lighter to melt the boning into one piece at the top so that it can have easy access into the channels provided. Make sure you squeeze your boning very hard for it to create a mold. So once that is done, you can go ahead penetrating all your bonings through the channels provided, and you can secure with your sewing pins. Now you can sew along the hemline using your 0.5cm seam allowance. So bear in mind, I am using an industrial machine, and that can take the boning. So make sure you check your machine before you go ahead with this procedure. So I'm going to go ahead using my bias pieces to sew around the hemline. So I'm using 2cm wide bias piece for my hemline. So I'm going to go ahead to join this using my sewing machine. Now I'm going to use these loops that I previously created to finish the center back. Feel free to use whatever finishing you need for your corset. It's totally up to you. So I'm using 6 loops, and they are 5cm long, and they are sewn on a band that is 1.5 inches wide. So whatever length you need is totally up to you. So I'm going to mirror both pieces and pin them together and sew this with my sewing machine. So because I'm using loops for my finishing, I am going to take out 1 centimeter from my center back. I am going to go ahead to attach my loops to the center back, and that will be all for the corset. Due to the length of this video, I wouldn't be able to show every detail, but feel free to ask if you need any clarification in anything that we've just covered. So here is the final look. So thank you so much for joining in, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.